At the edge of downtown Dallas, the Union Pacific Railroad crosses the triple underpass at a place called Dealey Plaza. On the north side of Dealey Plaza are the Dallas County Jail, the courthouse, and the Texas School Book Depository. In Dealey Plaza, it is always November the 22nd, 1963.
I noticed that there are a number of hidden zippers in these jackets. Now, what are these for, Betsy? They can't be for, is it for mad money?
Well, it depends on where they're placed. They can be wherever you want them.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin. This is from the United Press from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were
School
fired.
Book Depository, headed for the triple underpass. There were three loud, reverberating
Shots were fired. He happened to look up at about the 5th or 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. He said he saw the rifle being pulled back in. President Kennedy.
Bert. Let's see. Let's get reorganized here. Grab that cable over there. We're on the air, Bert, and let's talk to you.
Officials were en route as fast as they could get there to Parkland Hospital.
This is what I've been told now, Jay. President was shot in the head. Connally was shot in the chest. Both of them are still alive when I left the hospital.
Do you have some film?
And, yeah, I have film
Will
at the
you get
hospital.
the film and see if you can get it developed real quick,
Yeah,
and
I
we'll
will.
put it on the air.
And,
A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital. Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in.
When I first looked over the balcony to where the chaos was taking place, this gentleman and his wife and 2 children were on the grass.
And we heard a blast, and the president looked like that he right jumped up in his seat, and then we seen him get shot in the side of the head, and he fell back in the seat, and Governor Connally was holding his stomach.
Nobody moved. Everyone seemed stunned. A few seemed to look around, wondering who has the firecrackers. Then
The gentleman just walked in our studio that I am meeting for the first time, as well as you. This is WFAA-TV in Dallas, Texas. May I have your name, please, sir?
My name is Abraham Zapruder.
Mr. Zapruder?
Zapruder, yes, sir.
Zapruder. And would you tell us your story, please, sir?
I got out and about a half hour earlier, getting to a good spot to shoot some pictures. As the president was making his turn, I had a shot. And he slumped to the side like this. Then I had another shot or two. I couldn't say what it was, 1 or 2. And I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything. And I kept on shooting. That's about all. I'm just sick again.
I think that pretty well expresses the entire feelings of
terrible.
the whole world.
Within 2 hours, the police had arrested a suspect. 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marxist, an active supporter of Fidel Castro, who had once defected to the Soviet Union.
The original complaint that the police department filed on Lee Oswald around midnight on the 22nd of November said that Lee Oswald did, in furtherance of an international communist conspiracy, assassinate President John F. Kennedy.
The White House feared that Oswald's communist connections might spark an international crisis. So Lyndon Johnson demanded that the charge of conspiracy be dropped. Johnson persuaded the Chief Justice to chair a commission of inquiry. 9 months later, the Warren Commission concluded there had been no conspiracy. But in 1979, the House Assassinations Committee concluded there probably had been a plot to kill the president. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories have multiplied, as Hollywood movies and 2,000 books have accused the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, Fidel Castro, anti-Castro Cubans, the KGB, the Mafia, right-wing oilmen, and even Lyndon Johnson himself of assassinating John Kennedy.
Increasingly in the last 30 years, Oswald has become a footnote to the story. He is lost under a deluge of details about trajectory angles and ballistics and forensics and possible plotters. If we have no understanding in this sterile presentation of him, of his real character and what motivates him.
I'm just a patsy.
Lone gunman, conspirator, or patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald remains the central mystery at the heart of the Kennedy assassination.
any effort to explain what happened in Dallas must explain Lee Harvey Oswald. And Lee Harvey Oswald is a mystery wrapped up in an enigma, hidden behind a riddle. He is not, I put it in simple words, an easy man to explain.
And easy explanations died 30 years ago when Oswald, in his turn, fell to an assassin's bullet. The Bronx Zoo was a haven for Lee Oswald. He seemed to prefer the company of animals to people. He had not set foot in school for nearly 2 months when he was picked up for truancy at the zoo. He was taken to juvenile court and became case number 23979.
I remember him vividly. He was a skinny, unprepossessing kid. He was not a mentally disturbed kid. As a matter of fact, his IQ was better than average. He was just emotionally frozen. He was a kid who had never developed a really trusting relationship with anybody.
Lee was a truant, but not a delinquent. He spent endless hours roaming the New York subway system alone. He haunted public libraries and museums.
From what I could garner, he really interacted with no one. He made his own meals. His mother left at around 7 and came home at 7, and he shifted for himself. You got the feeling of a kid nobody gave a darn about him. He was just floating along in the world with no emotional resources at all.
He was born in New Orleans in 1939, but never knew his father.
You go back to the death of his dad 2 months before he was born, that's a tremendous impact. What Lee missed from his childhood in comparison to me was the whole family being together all the time, the continuity there. The lack of stability, I think, entered into that to a large degree. I don't know at what age Mother verbalized to Lee the effect that she felt he was a burden to her. Certainly by age 3, he had the sense that, we were a burden.
Lee's mother, Marguerite, had also grown up without a parent.
She had certain characteristics that were so much like Lee. The time and circumstances always seemed to be against her. The world owed her a living. She wanted to be somebody. I think this was passed on to Lee.
When he was 13, Lee and his mother moved into a small apartment in the Bronx. His boyhood had taught him that life was unfair. He sought solace in socialism.
I was looking for a key to my environment, and then I discovered socialist literature. I had to dig for my books in the back dusty shelves of libraries.
When the truant officer came again, Lee's mother decided to flee New York. Lee and Marguerite returned to New Orleans. They moved into a bad neighborhood on the edge of the French Quarter. Lee's interest in socialism seems to have diverted him from the vices of the area.
Dear sirs, I am 16 years of age and would like more information about your youth league. I would like to know if there is a branch in my area. I am a Marxist and have been studying social principles for well over 15 months. I am very interested in your YPSL. Sincerely, Lee Oswald.
Despite his Marxist beliefs, he became a cadet in the Civil Air Patrol. He was keen to follow his older brothers into the armed forces. It was the first in a lifetime of contradictory acts. In 1957, Lee became a U.S. Marine. He was just 17. He received extensive training in marksmanship. Some have claimed that he was a poor shot, but the record shows he was more than competent.
He shoots on a rifle range 212, which means he qualifies for the second highest position in the Marine Corps, that of a sharpshooter. Near the end of his stay in the Marines in 1959, he went back to requalify himself in the range, still shot 191, and still qualified as a marksman. That meant that he could hit the target 8 times out of 10 from 200 yards away.
He was smart enough to be trained as a radar controller. He was posted to a base in Japan, where he had access to classified material.
Oswald enters the Marines with such high hopes, but it quickly unravels for him. Just a year after entering, he wounds himself with a pistol that he's not supposed to have. And as a result, he's court-martialed. And then he's put on KP duty for a very long stint. He's very dissatisfied with it. Eventually, he attacks the sergeant that he believes is responsible for his long KP service in a bar and challenges him to a fight. Then he's court-martialed a second time. This time he's put into the brig. And this has an effect on him. The brig is very hard. And when he comes out, he's now an embittered person.
If you complained about, oh, we've got to go on a march this morning, or we've got to do this morning, scrub barracks, or whatever we had to do, if you were complaining about it, he would say that that was the capitalist form of government making us do these things. Karl Marx and his form of government would alleviate that.
He made no secret of his Marxist beliefs. He was nicknamed Oswaldovich by his fellow Marines.
Sir, down on deck is 45 United States Marine Corps M16A2 sir.
Lee Oswald asked for an early discharge from the Marines. The day it was approved, he applied for a passport. In September 1959, Lee Oswald arrived in Russia. He'd planned his trip in secret, and some have wondered if it was financed by Soviet intelligence. A disaffected Marxist with access to military secrets, Oswald certainly fitted the common profile of a Cold War traitor. It is still not clear how Lee Oswald, with only $200 in his bank account, could travel to Moscow as a deluxe-class tourist with his own car, driver, and personal in-tourist guide.
I took him for an excursion around the city. We went to the most important sites of Moscow, such as Tretyakov Art Gallery, the cathedrals, and the treasury of the Moscow Kremlin.
But Oswald seemed uninterested in the sights. On their second day, he told Rima the real reason for his trip. He had come to Moscow to defect.
I was shocked. I asked his motives, his reasons, and he said that it was his political views. He said that he was a communist.
Rima took his request to the Soviet authorities. Oswald later recorded the official response in what he called his historic diary.
I must leave country tonight at 8 p.m. as visa expires. I am shocked. My dreams. I retire to my room.
That same afternoon, we were to meet downstairs as usual. Some time passed, but he didn't appear. Certainly, I was nervous and wanted to know what had happened. So that's why I rushed upstairs. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer. We all tumbled in the room, and behind the shoulders of the two men, I saw Lee in the bath. So it was water there, and it was reddish, so it was blood. Lee cut his wrist.
Oswald was rushed unconscious to hospital. A week later, he was about to be discharged when his doctor got a call from the KGB telling her to hold Oswald until they arrived.
Sometime later, about 40 minutes, a large black car arrived and 3 young men came in. They confiscated his medical history, his discharge paper, and all his documents. And then they told me they were taking him away.
What happened next is unknown. For 30 years, the KGB has maintained that it never interrogated Oswald. The former head of the KGB who handled Oswald's case is Vladimir Semichastny. It is only now that men like Semichastny can tell the KGB's version of events.
Counterintelligence and intelligence, they both looked him over to see what he was capable of. But unfortunately, neither could find any ability at all.
The KGB moved Oswald to a hotel while they considered his fate. After 3 days, Lee could bear the waiting no longer.
It seems like 3 years. I must have some sort of a showdown.
He marched into the U.S. Embassy and demanded to see the consul.
They put a piece of paper on my desk. It said, I have come to revoke my American citizenship. I have applied for Soviet citizenship. He also volunteered the information that he'd been, while in the Marines, he'd been a radar technician. And that when he became a Soviet citizen, he intended to offer to the Soviet authorities everything that he had learned.
Until now, the KGB has always maintained that it never questioned Oswald about his military service.
There were conversations, but this was such outdated information. The kind we say the sparrows have already chirped to the entire world. And now Oswald tells us about it. Not the kind of information that would interest such a high-level organization like ours.
By now, word of Oswald's suicide attempt had reached the Kremlin. Ekaterina Futseva, the highest-ranking woman in the Politburo, was furious when she read that an idealistic young socialist was being turned away. She used her influence with Nikita Khrushchev to force the KGB to change its tune.
If he's begging, to hell with him. Let him stay here in order to avoid an international scandal on account of such a nobody. We were not convinced this would be his last act of blackmail. We expected he would try again, which would be difficult to deal with in Moscow. So we decided to send him to Minsk.
In January 1960, Lee Oswald arrived in Minsk. He was found a job in a TV factory and given a choice apartment to himself, a luxury unheard of for a young bachelor. Naturally, the KGB planted a bug in the ceiling. An American in Minsk was a rarity, and Lee Oswald was befriended by a small group of college students anxious to improve their English.
The door of Henry's lunch counter opened and 2 men came in.
One of them taped Oswald's voice to study his southern accent.
I gave him rather chance pieces to read, and those happened to be, well, Shakespeare, from Othello, Ernest Hemingway.
The two men at the counter of the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched.
They also improvised dialogues, in which Titovets would interview Oswald. In one of these sessions, Lee Oswald adopted the role of a mass murderer.
Well, okay. Will you tell us about your last killing?
Well, it was a young girl under a bridge. She came in carrying a loaf of bread, and I just cut her throat from ear to ear.
What for?
Well, I wanted the loaf of bread, of course.
What do you take to be the most famous killing in your life?
Well, the time I killed 8 men on the Bowery, the sidewalk there, they were just standing there loafing around. I didn't like their faces, so I just shot them all with a machine gun. It was very, very famous. All the newspapers carried the story.
We're just having a great time, and actually we're laughing our heads off.
In Minsk, Oswald had the chance to do what he had always wanted to do: live in a socialist society. But the KGB was suspicious. It wanted to know if the young American was a false defector who was really working for US intelligence. At the Minsk television factory, Oswald's new friends and workmates were forced to inform on him.
I was met by one of their people, and it was like this. He said, "Your country asks you, your country demands. There is a foreigner here. It's in the country's interest for security, and so on." That was early on, but I told him about it a year later. I had 3 or 4 meetings with the KGB people. They gave me little assignments to provoke him, saying, try this out on him and see what he says.
The work is drab. The money I get has nowhere to be spent. As my Russian improves, I become increasingly conscious of just what sort of a society I live in.
After a year, Lee Oswald wanted to go home. Then, one night at a dance in the Palace of Culture, he was introduced to Marina Prusakova.
She was a very attractive lady. She dressed well. We went up to her with Lee Harvey Oswald, and he said straight away that he would like to get to know her. We were standing right here, beside that column. Of course, he fell in love with her straight away, at first sight, as we say in Russia.
Marina Oswald declined to be interviewed for this program, but she talked at length to writer Priscilla Macmillan. Macmillan befriended Marina after the assassination and wrote an intimate portrait of her life with Lee.
Marina liked Lee for several reasons. One was that he was polite. She liked his being foreign. She thought that an American would treat her better than a Russian. And he asked her to be his fiancée.
6 weeks after they met, a hasty wedding party was arranged, and Lee and Marina began married life together. From the outset, it was never an ideal marriage. One of the few things they agreed on was that they and their baby daughter June should go and live in the United States. Through its bug in the ceiling, the KGB listened in to the increasingly furious rows between the young couple. But 2.5 years of continuous surveillance had revealed nothing.
We concluded that he was not working for American intelligence. His intellectual training, experience, and capabilities were such that it would not show the FBI and the CIA in a good light if they used people like him.
An exit visa was finally issued, and Oswald's 2.5-year Russian sojourn was at an end. On June the 2nd, 1962, he and Marina left for the United States. They disembarked in New York and flew on to Dallas.
He had prepared answers and statements, anticipating reporters either at the ship or someplace down the line on the return. And I think he was surprised when he stepped off the plane in Dallas Love Field. He asked me, "What, no reporters?" I said, "Yes, I've been managed to keep it quiet." And that was it. But I think he was disappointed.
Lee, Marina, and baby June moved into Robert Oswald's suburban home in Fort Worth, Texas. 2 weeks later, the FBI interviewed him about his stay in Russia and filed a report.
Oswald appeared at the Fort Worth resident agency and was interviewed by two agents who happened to be in the office. This interview did not turn out to be too successful because Oswald was in an aggressive, surly mood, and they finally broke the interview off after a little while.
He said they even asked me, you know, if I'd ever been an agent of the federal government or the CIA. He says, "Well, don't you know?" And he just laughed. He was in control of the FBI then. They didn't know for sure if he was an agent or not. He was toying with them, and he toyed with people like that.
Exactly 1 year before President Kennedy was assassinated, there was an Oswald family reunion.
Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 1962, we are all having a pleasant holiday atmosphere. Everybody's getting along fine. And Lee didn't seem under any particular strain, no indication of any particular problems.
But all was not well with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee became more and more tense, and he began to hit Marina, something he had never done before. And by the winter, he hit her more and more frequently and harder.
He had found a job at an industrial photo lab, but he was beginning to live a double life. He used his skills to create a new identity. Using the name Alec J. Heidel, he forged an ID card. He would make much use of his new alias. He opened a post office box to receive mail for himself and for Heidel.
Lee began to receive publications that he did not want to get at home. They were The Worker, the newspaper of the American Communist Party, The Militant, newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party. All of this he wanted to receive without his landlords noticing.
The left-wing press embraced issues that were important to him, such as civil rights and Castro's Cuba. Disillusioned with Soviet communism, he now saw Cuba as the Marxist ideal. He was angered by President Kennedy's hostility to Castro. One night at a party in February 1963, Lee Oswald met a German oil geologist. They settled down by a window to talk politics.
Lee Harvey Oswald brought up in the conversation with me the fact that he really felt very angry about the support which the Kennedy administration gave to the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Schmidt says he tried to turn Lee's anger away from Kennedy and onto a more deserving target. General Edwin Walker was everything that Oswald hated. He was a virulent anti-communist whom Kennedy had fired for right-wing extremism. He was also violently opposed to black civil rights.
In hindsight, I probably may have given Lee Harvey Oswald the idea to go after General Walker. He may also have thought of General Walker independently. But whatever it is, he would have found a victim because he was so obsessed of doing something.
Oswald had already used his Heidel alias to order a .38 revolver through the mail. Now he purchased a cheap Italian rifle with a telescopic sight. He began to spy on General Walker's house. He had decided on a plan of action.
Oswald had an entire book of operations for his Walker action, including photographs of Walker's house, photographs of an area that he intended to stash the rifle, maps that he had drawn very carefully, statements of political purpose. In the end, he wanted this to be an important historical feat, and this was to be the documentation left behind.
Lee's guns finally arrived in the mail. Eager to show them off to Marina, he surprised her while she was hanging up the laundry in the backyard. He asked her to take his photograph.
Dressed all in black, he was carrying his rifle, had his pistol at his waist, and she burst out laughing and asked him what on earth he was doing in that costume, and he told her she was to take a picture of him.
Many, like filmmaker Oliver Stone, have disputed the authenticity of the backyard photograph.
Oswald himself, shown those photographs, denied that he owned a rifle and denied that this was him in it. He said his head was pasted on it. Marina testifies that she took it. She identifies the camera that she used. The FBI was able to the exclusion of all other cameras, tie that camera to these photographs. Assuming that all that's fake, we went further with a photographic panel and studied very carefully all of the testimony about the shadows being inappropriate. Our photographic panel indicated in great detail that these shadows were not inappropriate, that the critics had simply not understood optics accordingly.
Oswald gave a copy of the photograph to a friend. On the back, someone wrote in Russian, "Hunter of fascists, ha ha ha." Oswald's own signature is on the bottom. On April the 1st, Lee was fired from his job. Marina says he spent a few evenings at target practice. On the night of April the 12th, she says he didn't come home at all.
At about 10, he still hadn't come home. She was worried. She walked into a room, his study, which he told her never to enter. And there, on his desk, she saw a sheet of paper with a key lying on top of it.
Lee had left a note for Marina, written in Russian.
Here is the key to the post office box. You can throw out my clothing, but as for my personal papers, I prefer you keep them. I left you as much money as I could.
That evening, someone fired a single shot through the window of General Walker's study.
Looking the situation over, back there 40 steps behind me.
Miraculously, General Walker survived to tell his story.
A bullet crashed through the window and just missed me. And it felt much grit and dirt in my hair. And my arm was laying on the desk, and it was bleeding in 3 places, which turned out to be fragments from the shell casing.
The radio broadcast that a boy on the spot had seen 1 or 2 cars in the alleyway behind Walker's house. Lee laughed. He exploded in laughter. And he said, "Americans are so spoiled. They think you always have to have a car, whereas I got away on my own 2 feet." Lee explained to Marina that he had jumped on a bus, buried the rifle, and then he'd taken another bus. And he said when he took the bus, there they lose the scent.
Until the assassination of John Kennedy, the Walker shooting remained unsolved. 2 weeks later, Oswald abruptly left Dallas. In April 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to New Orleans. He was about to enter the most mysterious chapter of his short life. The city to which he returned was seething with intrigue and paranoia. New Orleans had welcomed thousands of Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's communism. These were the people whom Castro called gusanos, the worms. As in Miami, they were fervently anti-communist. In the swamps and bayous, then as now, violent paramilitary groups prepared to overthrow Castro.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But after the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's support began to wane. The hard men and the paramilitary groups felt betrayed. In New Orleans, the Cuban enclaves burned with a murderous hatred for the president. In the spring of 1963, nothing could have been more provocative than Oswald's open espousal of Castro's cause.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that
Oswald defended Castro on local radio and gave a television interview about his own Marxist beliefs.
Then are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
It all began in May 1963 when Oswald printed some pro-Castro leaflets. He pretended he was part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, but there were no other members in New Orleans.
We have had members in this area for several months now. We have decided to feel out the public what they think of our organization, our aims, and for that purpose we have been distributing literature on the street.
Oswald's pro-Castro activities seemed genuine enough, but then he appears to have changed sides. In August, he approached the leader of an anti-Castro group called Carlos Bringuer.
When Oswald came to my store for the first time, he was explaining how he was against Castro, and he was asking in what way he could help us to fight against Castro. He was telling me that he had been in the Marine Corps, that he had experience in guerrilla warfare, and that he can help us in the guerrilla fight against Castro. The second time that Oswald came to my store was when he brought this guidebook from Marines. He said that this was a present for me to see if this could help me out to fight Castro.
The manual showed how to make bombs, booby traps, and conduct sabotage operations. A few days later, Carlos Bringuer was enraged to find Oswald handing out pro-Castro leaflets on Canal Street.
When he recognized me, he smiled at me, and he even tried to shake hands with me. I refused to shake hands with him, and I started insulting him and cursing him in English.
Police were called to the scene, where an amateur movie maker filmed the angry Cubans as they crowded around Oswald.
When we got out of the vehicle and approached the crowd, there was about 8 or 10 Hispanic people that were taunting him, yelling at him, asking him to hand over the papers to them so they could dispose of them.
At that time, I get angry, and I was approaching Oswald, trying to punch him in the face. When he saw that I was approaching and he sensed my intention, he put his arm down and he said to me, "Okay, Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me." Immediately, I realized that he wanted to appear as a victim, as a martyr.
When someone seized the pro-Castro leaflets and threw them on the ground, the police arrested Oswald and 8 Cubans for disturbing the peace. Oswald's conduct was even more mysterious at the police station.
We advised him that the booking procedure, which was a municipal misdemeanor, that he was eligible for posting a bond of $25 in cash or getting a politician to parole him. He said he did not want either. He wanted to go to jail. We also told him that part of the booking procedure would to be that he would have to be photographed and fingerprinted, which he agreed to. He insisted almost that we fingerprint and photograph him. He seemed to want to let everyone know who he was and what he was doing. He could have avoided it very, very simply by saying, hey, here's my $25, let me go home.
A few days later, Oswald and the Cubans appeared in court.
Well, I think if we take Oswald at the simplest level, what we see he's trying to do is enhance his credentials as a supporter of Castro. One of the ways he's trying to do this is actually work for Castro. Another way, he's trying to find out information that would be of use to Castro, and the normal way you find out information is you join the enemy.
What kind of double game was Oswald playing? One piece of evidence raises important questions about whose side he was really on.
The leaflets that Oswald hands out on Canal Street is pro-Castro leaflets, hands off Cuba, telling the government to leave it alone, let it stay communist, let Castro alone. And the return addresses that are stamped on it is 544 Camp Street.
In that same building, there is a private detective agency by a man named Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister is certainly not pro-Castro. He's an ex-FBI agent from New York who is a violently anti-Castro and working to overthrow Castro. If Lee Harvey Oswald is connected to Bannister, then the pro-Castro activity seems to be a sham.
Bannister was no armchair anti-communist. He helped provide military training for Cuban exiles. One of Bannister's comrades in the fight against Castro was a pilot named David Ferry. Ferry had flown many dangerous missions over Cuba, but in the 1950s he had instructed cadets in the Civil Air Patrol. This was the very same time that the young Lee Oswald had also been in the CAP. But after the assassination, Ferry denied that he had ever known Oswald. But researchers for this program uncovered the first hard evidence that places Oswald and Ferry together. It is a photograph taken in 1955 at a Civil Air Patrol cookout. Some eyewitnesses suggest that Ferry and Oswald may have renewed their acquaintance in the fatal summer of 1963. If David Ferry was seen with Lee Oswald, it is significant because Ferry, like his associate Guy Bannister, was working for one of the major figures in organized crime.
We took very seriously the possibility that organized crime had a hand in the president's death. The FBI had illegal electronic surveillance on the major figures of organized crime. We did a survey of that surveillance. What we did find, and shockingly, is repeated conversations by these people that indicated the depth of their hatred for Kennedy and actual discussions of they ought to be killed, they ought to be whacked.
No mobster hated the Kennedys more than Carlos Marcello, the mafia chieftain of New Orleans. In 1963, Robert Kennedy had personally ordered his arrest and deportation. The Godfather had been humiliated.
Carlos Marcello talks about he speaks in Sicilian, getting the stone out of my shoe, and talking about getting a nut to kill not Bobby Kennedy, who was his nemesis, but John Kennedy, who was the man behind the nemesis.
When Marcello returned to New Orleans, his attorneys hired David Ferry as an investigator.
When you find David Ferry being a boyhood friend to Lee Harvey Oswald, and with him that summer, and with Carlos Marcello at that very point in time, you have an immediate connection between a man who had the motive, opportunity, and means to kill Kennedy, and the man who killed Kennedy. I think what many conspiracy critics do is they try to take the chain, the connections, too far back. They say Oswald knew Ferry, and Ferry did some investigative work for Marcello, and Bannister did some investigative work for Marcello. Marcello hated Kennedy, and therefore it must have been Marcello deciding to kill Kennedy, down to Ferry and Bannister, who then gave the order to Oswald, who went off and did it. It's wonderful speculation. There's just no evidence to back it up.
If Lee Oswald was secretly connected with anti-Castro forces or the Mafia, the nature of the relationship remains unclear. And that elusive evidence must be weighed against the hard fact of Oswald's pro-Castro activity, which was now about to attract the attention of an anti-communist organization called Inca.
These are officials of Inca, the Information Council of the Americas, an organization which, through its truth tapes and film productions, reaches millions of people in the hemisphere. Ed Butler, who conceived and initiated the organization. As executive vice president, he is in charge of the Inca program and engages in direct personal conflict with communism.
When Ed Butler and Carlos Bringuer were invited to debate Lee Oswald on a local radio show that August, Butler did some background research.
We found out after I had accepted the interview about Oswald's defection to Russia. The information came from the House Un-American Activities Committee files. They sent me the material, I requested it, and they sent it.
Where did they get it from?
They got it from the newspapers, the open press. That's basically what they sent me, clippings that Oswald had defected to Russia and so forth.
After Oswald's death, the other participants reenacted the radio discussion on film, using the original sound recording of Oswald's voice.
And now back to conversation carte blanche. Here again, Bill Slatter.
Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe you have a question for him.
I would like to know, is it fair play for Cuba committee or fair play for Russia committee?
Well, that is, of course, very provocative and a question I don't think it requires an answer.
Oh, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist-run organization?
We have been investigated from several points of view. That is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, subversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
Although I don't know that you admit that you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point? Are you or have you been a communist?
Oswald was unaware that his opponents knew all about his defection to Russia.
Are you a Marxist?
He was about to be exposed live on air.
Mr. Butler brought some newspaper clippings to my attention. You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think those, the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist controlled.
I think he was surprised, but again, he handled it, if you listen to the debate, very coolly, and it impeached his credibility. And yet he managed to turn it to his advantage, which is, I think, shows some aplomb, certainly a lot more than most people give him credit for.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Our time is almost up. Thank you very much, and good evening.
The last thing that I remember was Oswald taking out a notebook, glancing up at me and fixing me with a gaze of hatred and asking for my name and address and phone number and writing it down in the notebook, snapping it shut, looking up, and giving me that Oswald sneer. I went one way and he went the other.
At home, Marina saw no evidence of Oswald's supposed right-wing associations. Lee told her that he wanted to go to Cuba to fight for Castro's revolution. One evening, she found him on the porch working the bolt on his rifle.
And he was aiming it. She was extremely surprised at this. She hated to see him with the rifle again. But he continued to dry fire the rifle for the last part of August and the first part of September.
Lee told Marina that he was hatching a scheme to hijack a plane to Havana and needed her help.
And at a certain point, he would put a gun in the back of the pilot of the aircraft. She would stand up and keep the entire passenger contingent at bay with a pistol and speak to them, and she would speak to the crowd and tell them to be quiet. Marina laughed at him and said, "Well, but I don't speak English. How am I going to explain to them?" Eventually, she laughed him out of the skyjacking plan, and he came home one day and said, "Mama, I found a legal way. Go to Mexico."
On September the 26th, Lee Oswald is seen alone on a bus heading south from Laredo to Mexico City. In Mexico City, Lee Oswald found a cheap hotel not far from the bus station. He had bought a file on his political activity in New Orleans. In it, he detailed the leafleting, the arrest, and the appearances on radio and television. He also described himself as a Marxist, political organizer, and street agitator who had infiltrated Carlos Bringuer's anti-Castro group. That same day, Oswald went to the Cuban consulate, where he was met by Sylvia Duran, who told him he could only enter Cuba on a temporary visa and only if he was in transit to Russia. So Oswald walked the short distance to the Soviet diplomatic compound. Throughout that summer, the Oswalds had been trying to be readmitted to Russia. Lee had told Marina he would travel through Cuba and then meet her in Leningrad. At the Soviet embassy, he met with 3 consular officials. In fact, all 3 were KGB officers working in Mexico under diplomatic cover. In this, their first interview, they recall that when Oswald showed up, he was in a nervous condition, his hands were shaking, and his behavior was erratic.
Общее наше мнение было такое, что это человек.
We all thought the man had an unstable nervous system. He was extremely agitated.
Очень сильно взвинчен.
Во время нашей беседы Освальд постоянно.
During our talk, Oswald kept feeling in his pockets, taking out all sorts of papers. Then he took out a gun and put it in front of him. I sat opposite him, I took the gun away and put it on Pavel's desk.
И передал Павлу на стол. Эти вопросы ему задавал Павел Антонович.
Pavel Antonovich asked him, "Why did you come here with a gun? What do you need a gun for?" He said, "I'm afraid of the FBI. I'm being persecuted. I need a gun to protect myself, for my personal safety." That's what he said.
Вот его был ответ.
Я думаю, что он так думал, подозревал это.
His behavior certainly served to confirm this.
Говорила об этом. В частности,
Valery saw that when he left the embassy, he covered himself, wrapped himself tighter, and behaved like somebody who was hiding from someone.
что он от кого-то скрывается.
It was going to take months to get a Soviet visa, and without one, entry to Cuba was barred. When Sylvia Duran explained this, Oswald took it very badly.
Well, then I explained, and then he got in that moment, he couldn't believe what I was saying, and he said, "But that's impossible. I have to go to Cuba right now because I only have a permission of 3 or 4 days in Mexico City, so I have to go." I thought that in a moment or he will be crying because his eyes, he was very excited, he was very red, and his eyes is like with bright, shining, like he was in tears. So. And he didn't want to understand. And so I called the consul Asque.
Oswald lost his temper and called the consul a petty bureaucrat.
Then Asque says, "Listen, get out. Get out." And he went to the door that it was locked. He opened and he said, "Get out. And if I see you again, if you come again, I want to kick you out.
As Oswald left the Cuban and Soviet embassies, he was being watched. These photographs taken by Cuban intelligence show CIA operatives at work. From houses across the street, the agency maintained non-stop photographic surveillance on both embassies. And yet, incredibly, the CIA claims that it failed to take one single photograph of Oswald. This man was photographed leaving the Russian embassy. At first, the CIA thought it was Oswald. The agency quickly realized its mistake. The absence of any photos of the real Oswald has fueled speculation that he never went to Mexico and that he may have been impersonated by an imposter, like the man in the CIA photograph.
Нет, это совершенно другой человек.
No, this is a completely different person. The Oswald who had visited our embassy and whose photographs I saw in many newspapers and on TV was completely different.
The day after the assassination, in the Mexican newspapers were a photo of Oswald. And I said to my husband, I'm sure that this is the man who went to ask for a visa. So I went to the embassy and I looked up the applications and I saw his application and it was the same one.
We obtained from the Cuban officials the visa application with his photograph on it and his signature. We verified that it was Oswald's signature. Oswald, therefore, was in Mexico City.
Oswald's trip to Mexico had ended in failure. The Russians and the Cubans rejected him. All his plans to fight for Castro and return to Russia had come to nothing. He had nowhere to go but back to America. In the early hours of an October morning, Oswald boarded a bus heading north. A fellow passenger remembers him sitting alone, his head leaning against the window. He seemed quiet, depressed, and preoccupied. Next day, he crossed the US border. Seven weeks before President Kennedy's fatal motorcade through Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to the city. With no place to call his own, he headed for the YMCA. He had no job and no means to support his wife and daughter. Because Lee Oswald could not afford her medical bills, Marina had moved in with their friend, Ruth Payne.
Soon after, Lee came back to Texas, and we were talking about the fact that Lee hadn't been able to get a job and he was looking for work and needed work. And another neighbor there said that her brother worked at the Texas School Book Depository and she thought that they were still hiring people. So I called the School Book Depository to see whether there might be an opening there.
Simple happenstance, it seems, got Oswald his job at the Texas School Book Depository. Hired as a warehouseman, his was a low-paid job with few prospects.
He came out each weekend. He and Marina did argue a good bit, and I was somewhat impatient with him. She was saying, you see, he doesn't love me. And all the time I knew her, she was worried about whether he loved her or not.
Well, he came out on weekends. I remember stepping over him one time as he was watching TV, watching the football game. He was chin in his hands there, and thinking, what a fine little a revolutionary we have here being snookered into the new opiate of the people, football.
Michael Payne and Lee Oswald talked politics on weekends.
He thought capitalism was rotten. It was a fraud, and it needed to be overthrown. Lee wanted to be an active guerrilla in the effort to bring about a new world order. We discovered we were both interested in the activities of right-wing groups in Dallas. And I think he described his activities as spying on them.
When General Edwin Walker held a racist rally in Dallas, Oswald went to see the man he had once tried to assassinate.
There was no doubt in my mind that he believed violence was the only effective tool. He didn't want to mess around with trying to change the system.
There's no hard evidence that Oswald was meeting any co-conspirators during these last days in Dallas. At the end of every working day, he rode the bus to a rooming house. He spent weekends with his family. He is never seen with mysterious associates from New Orleans. But Lee Oswald was behaving strangely. At the rooming house, he kept making calls from the payphone across the street. Then, on the Sunday 5 days before the assassination, Ruth Paine tried to phone him.
And I dialed the number, asked for Lee Oswald, and was told, no, Lee Oswald lives here. And so I checked, is this the number? Yes, it was. And I really hung up in confusion and told Marina what had happened. Then the next day, when Lee called, as he normally did in the evening after work, Marina said we had tried to reach him and that there was no one of that name there. And he bawled her out for trying to reach him. When she hung up, she was very distressed, said that he was using an assumed name and he's done this before and he lives in this fantasy and he has this idea about being a great man. And she was very worried about him, worried about his mental state, as I understood it from her.
On Wednesday night, 2 days before the assassination, Oswald was in the rooming house watching TV when he saw a news story about President Kennedy's visit to Dallas. Dallas newspapers published more details, including a map of the motorcade route. The White House party was going to fly into Dallas and drive through the city. The planned route ran through Dealey Plaza, where the motorcade would drive right under the windows of the Texas School Book Depository. On Thursday evening, Oswald asked a co-worker to give him a lift to Ruth Paine's house.
And Marina thought he'd come to make up with her after a fight they'd had. He tried to kiss her, she didn't let him. And he said to her that she was getting spoiled, living with Americans. And early that evening, he asked her on 3 separate occasions to join him in Dallas, and if she would, he would get an apartment the next day.
But Marina was still angry, and she said no. Sometime that evening, Oswald entered the garage, where he kept his rifle.
I went into the garage and the light was on, which surprised me because I knew Marina was pretty careful turning the light out when she went in the garage for anything. And I hadn't been in the garage, so I assumed that Lee had been in there and forgotten to turn the light out.
Lee Oswald woke up early next morning. He told Marina not to get up and made himself some coffee. Then he kissed the children and told Marina goodbye.
Later, she found what he'd left on the bureau. It was $170, and she thought to herself, that must be everything Lee had. And she found something else. It was Lee's wedding ring, and he left it in a little cup that her grandmother had given her.
Oswald was carrying a long oblong package wrapped in brown paper when he left the house. He told the neighbor who drove him to work that the package contained curtain rods, but he could have been taking his disassembled rifle to the Texas School Book Depository. In Fort Worth, President Kennedy was up early that morning. The Secret Service was nervous about his trip to Texas. The perceived threat came from right-wing extremists.
When I turned on the TV that morning of the 22nd and was watching Kennedy come into the place where he was to talk for breakfast in Fort Worth. The newsman, the TV man, had to fill time because Kennedys were late. And he filled time by naming all the presidents who had been assassinated in the history of the United States. That's an environment in which a lot of people were thinking about the safety of the president and the threat to his safety that day.
Two years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
Kennedy's arrival was eagerly awaited by Oswald's co-workers.
We were looking out towards Elm Street. So he walked up and asked us, said, what is everybody looking for and what is everybody waiting on? So we told him we was waiting on the president to come by. He put his hand in his pocket and laughed and walked away. So I don't know where he went, or if he went upstairs or downstairs or wherever.
Oswald rode the elevator to the 6th floor. He spent the morning filling book orders. In Fort Worth, the president was heading for the airport and the short flight to Dallas. At about noon, Oswald's co-workers went down to lunch. Oswald shouted for them to send the elevator back up. By now, President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline had landed at Love Field. The welcome was warm. Inside the depository, someone had screened off a 6th floor window with boxes. 3 boxes formed a rest for the sniper's rifle. Later, Oswald's palm prints were found on these boxes. Several witnesses spotted a man with a rifle at the 6th floor window. They assumed he was there to protect the president. Oswald later claimed that at this time he was having lunch with 2 co-workers and had then gone to buy a Coke. But the other 2 men denied having lunch with him. Some witnesses thought they saw 2 men at the window, evidence, if true, of a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Amateur film shows the motorcade turning into Dealey Plaza and passing in front of the Texas School Book Depository. This footage has been enhanced to see if a second man can be seen on the 6th floor.
On the Hughes film, there are a lot of things to see, and on the 5th floor in particular, we see an employee of the book depository raise his right arm right there as he waves to the motorcade passing just under the building. Now we move to the 6th floor, and we observe in the arched window that is adjacent to the sniper's nest a form that some people have said is human-like in appearance. And when we ran the enhanced film in motion, that human form disappears, and we conclude there is no human form in that window. We do also conclude that there is movement in the 6th floor corner window indicating the presence of a person.
Just 7 seconds before the first shot is fired, something moves in the corner window. Right underneath, Harold Norman raises his arm and waves to the president.
We were sitting on the 5th floor, right directly on the 6th floor window. And the shots came from above, and there was a gun. The shots were sounding boom, click, click, boom, click, click, boom, click, click. So there was 3 shots fired right above us, and we were sitting on the 5th floor.
The tragedy unfolds frame by frame in the 21 seconds of amateur film shot by Abraham Zapruder. As the motorcade rounds the corner, it slows to 11 miles an hour. In the background, a little girl runs alongside the president's limousine. Suddenly, there's a gunshot. Governor Connolly hears it and turns. The little girl stops dead and looks round. 3 seconds later, a second shot. A bullet has passed through the president's throat. It hits Connolly in the back, and he starts falling into his wife's lap. Mrs. Kennedy turns to her husband. Something's wrong. She looks into his face. The fatal headshot. The number and timing of those shots have been argued over for 30 years. Now there's a growing consensus that 3 shots were fired in about 8 seconds. But many believe a second gunman fired a 4th shot from the grassy knoll. Immediately after the shooting, people followed a policeman up its embankment. No gunman, no gun, no cartridges were ever found. But a motorcycle policeman's radio button had jammed open, and it was later thought that the gunshots had been recorded on the police dispatcher's dictaphone.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations used sound experts to listen to a Dallas police dictabelt, and they concluded with a 95% certainty that there was a 4th shot fired at Dealey Plaza, and it came from the grassy knoll. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed their work and found a multitude of errors and omissions, the most serious of which was that the time that the Select Committee experts thought the shots were being fired was the wrong time. It was actually 1 minute after the assassination had actually taken place.
And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that...
In the chaos and confusion at Parkland Hospital, mistakes were made, and a later post-mortem was mishandled. But the autopsy photographs show that if there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll, he missed.
There were only 2 shots that struck President Kennedy. Both came from the rear. 4 government investigations all came to the same conclusion. The Warren Commission in the 60s, in 1968, the Clark panel set by Attorney General Ramsey Clark, in the 70s, the Rockefeller Commission, and finally in the late 70s, the House Select Committee, with the largest forensics panel re-examining the evidence.
Modern computer modeling is a technique that was not available to earlier investigators. The American Bar Association commissioned a specialist company called Failure Analysis to make these 3-dimensional graphics. They make it possible to model the trajectory of the so-called magic bullet, the second shot fired from the 6th floor window. Critics say that unless it pursued a bizarre zigzag trajectory, it was impossible for one bullet to pass through 2 men, inflict 7 wounds, and emerge virtually undamaged.
4 government commissions all concluded it was a straight line right through the 2 men. There's no question that a single bullet could inflict all 7 wounds on both the president and the governor and emerge in very good condition. As it slowed, as it moved through the 2 men, it moved fast enough to break bone, but not fast enough to deform the bullet. The computer technicians used reverse projection to go from the wounds on Kennedy and Connally and determine where the assassin had to be located to inflict those wounds. And a cone is splayed out from the wound and shows that the only area almost centers on the southeast corner, 6th floor Texas School Book Depository.
If the 3 shots were fired in 8 seconds, this is what the sniper would have seen as he took aim through his telescopic sight. After the 3rd shot, the sniper withdraws his rifle quite slowly. Leaving 3 cartridges on the floor, he makes his way to the stairs. A rifle with 1 shell still in the breech is later found behind some boxes. The assassin runs down the stairs. Oswald is first seen about 90 seconds later, standing by the door of the lunchroom, looking cool and collected. A policeman stops him, then lets him go. Before the building is sealed, Oswald leaves by the front door, apparently the only employee to do so. He boards a bus, but he gets out and hails a taxi when the bus gets stuck in traffic. He asks the taxi to drop him 3 blocks away from his rooming house, and Oswald hurries inside. Oswald changes his clothes and puts a .38 revolver into his waistband. He takes a light zippered jacket from his closet and leaves. By now, police have issued a description of a suspect in the Kennedy killing. They have sealed off the depository and started to search it floor by floor. Gerald Hill helped search the 6th floor.
It was dirty, it was dusty, it had an old wooden floor, it was an ancient building, it had boxes of books stacked here and there. There was a shield of boxes that were stacked in such a way that anybody coming off of the elevator or coming out of the stairwell would not see anyone who was down in a firing position between the barricade and the window.
A call came in that there had been a second shooting.
All we knew at that time was it was an officer had been shot, and they gave us a car number, and we knew it was Tippett based on the car number.
Officer J.D. Tippett had been patrolling a suburb called Oak Cliff when he was gunned down and left dead next to his car. There were 7 eyewitnesses, but the one with the clearest view was Jack Tatum.
I was preparing to turn left on 10th Street from Denver. I noticed an individual walking in my direction with a light zipper jacket on, darker pants, and a squad car pulling over to the curb next to him. As I approached the squad car, I noticed that that individual was leaning over talking to the officer, and he had both hands in the pockets of his jacket. I continued through the intersection, and about in the middle of the intersection, I heard 3, maybe 4 shots.
Dale Myers is an independent researcher who has studied the Tippett shooting.
Killer gets to about this position on the sidewalk, and Tippett's patrol car pulls to the curb and either calls him over to the curb or the man comes over by himself and leans to the window and talks to Tippett through the vent window for 10 or 20 seconds, very short. And Tippett gets out of the patrol car, and as he does, the man steps over to the front of the hood here, and as Tippett gets opposite him, he pulls a gun from under the jacket, fires 3 shots across the hood, knocking Tippett to the pavement. Then the man starts to leave, hesitates at the back of the car, walks around behind the car, comes up to the front of the car, stands over Tippett, and shoots him in the head.
He then looked around, surveyed the situation, and started a slow run toward my direction. I put my car in gear and drove forward and watched him through the rearview mirror. I saw him very clearly and realized that there was one thing that made him stand out, and that was his mouth that curled up. I couldn't mistake that.
Kind of a smile.
Yes, kind of a smile. And I was within 10, 15 feet of that individual, and it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Shortly after the shooting, several employees of a used car lot saw the killer come down this street. Ultimately, he came and he ducked behind this building, which used to be a Texaco service station. In 1963, this was a parking lot, and they found a jacket under this car. And it was a light gray Eisenhower-type jacket, much like the one that Oswald was seen zipping up as he left his rooming house. He's next seen without the jacket, kind of slinking down Jefferson, ducking in and out of stores as police cars are roaring up and down with their sirens blaring.
As the police cars sped by the Texas movie theater, the woman selling tickets stepped out of her kiosk. As she did so, Oswald slipped past her without buying a ticket. But someone had seen him and called the police.
And so we converged on that location. Hit the balcony first, I did. Because there was only one light on in the theater, we opened the side door to get some more light. We determined he wasn't in the balcony, and I came downstairs. As I got back to the lobby, I heard the sounds of a scuffle. I immediately went into the theater. I saw an officer scuffling with a suspect on the 3rd row from the back of the theater. It took 7 of us to put him on the floor and restrain him until we could put cuffs on him. Once we had the cuffs on him, he started hollering police brutality, is this America, this kind of thing.
Outside the movie house, an angry crowd jeered as Oswald was bundled into a police car.
Immediately, as we pulled away from the curb, we got on the radio and said we were en route to jail with our suspect. And the next thing that was asked was, what's your name? And he wouldn't tell us. And asked him, did he know why we had arrested him? And he said, I haven't done anything I should be ashamed of. He still refused to tell us who he was, and why don't you find out? So Officer Bentley reached in his hip pocket and pulled out his billfold. And here we had the dual identification. We had the Oswald and the Hidell identification.
Oswald was taken to police headquarters and driven down the ramp into an underground car park. There he was put into the elevator and led up to Captain Will Fritz, a homicide detective renowned in Texas for his skill as an interrogator.
for us, please, sir. Well, let's keep it quiet. We'll all get it. Hold it down. Has the gentleman been identified?
Yes, sir. He's been identified for killing the officer.
Right. Has any identification been attempted for the killing of the president?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I was in the hallway with all the other reporters when Fritz came out and asked me if I'd come in and sort of be the token reporter inside for a few minutes, and I went in to see Oswald, and I asked him about his eye, and he said that was when he was punched out and knocked down, wrestled down. The next question, why did you kill Officer Tippit? And he threw the question right back at me. He said, someone get killed? Policeman get killed? And at that time, he had this little smirk on him, and I wanted to hit him, but I didn't. Then all of a sudden, it dawned on me he wasn't sweating. Not a drop of sweat on him. He was calmer than all the people around him, Secret Service, police, FBI, district attorney. Everybody was in that office.
Well, he didn't admit anything and didn't confess to anything. He was the type of individual that you'd had to prove to him that we could make a case on him. And this is not unusual. This is very common among people that commit crime.
I don't think he would have broken and confessed. I think he was playing a game. He had the impression that he was smarter than everybody else and was going to sit back there and play this for all it was worth.
By now, the police had recovered the murder weapon, and the FBI had traced its purchase order to an A. Heidel.
The return address on this order letter was to the post office box in Dallas, Texas, of our suspect, Oswald. But it has definitely been established by the FBI that the handwriting is the handwriting of Oswald.
He was asked if he had ever used the name of A. Heidel. He said no, and he asked if he knew anybody named A. Heidel, and he said no. And then he was asked, is it true that when you was arrested you had a picture ID on there with A. Heidel on it? He said, I believe that's correct. And he asked, well, how do you explain that? And he says, I don't. He just cut it off like that.
Here comes Oswald down the hall again.
Did you buy that rifle? Just dispatches you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
What Oswald's interrogation shows is a very consistent pattern to hide a single fact through lies. That single fact was his ownership of the rifle. When he lied about the backyard photograph, it was to hide the fact he had a rifle. When he lied that he had ever used the alias Hidel, it was to hide the fact that he had ordered the rifle. You could go through the interrogation point by point and see that Oswald will be truthful up until it comes to the rifle. The point of the rifle, he hides his ownership of it. Now we're talking about the assassination weapon, and lying consistently to hide that shows, in my opinion, a consciousness of guilt on Oswald's part.
I don't know what this is all about.
You killed the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People
How'd you get the black eye?
Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. What time did you leave? I'm just a patsy.
President?
Around midnight, Oswald was paraded in front of the press. He had just been charged with the murder of Officer Tippit and was soon to be charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
You kill the president? No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You haven't. Nobody said what?
Sir?
At the back of the press conference was a man who was not a reporter or a policeman. He was a man who regularly carried a gun and who had underworld connections. Perhaps the strongest reason to believe in a conspiracy is that Jacob Rubenstein, alias Jack Ruby, would shoot Oswald dead in 36 hours' time.
If the mob had a hand in the president's death and they induced Oswald to kill the president, it was terribly important that he be silenced. There's every indication that Ruby stalked and killed Oswald in an effort to silence him.
A part-time police informer, Ruby liked to ensure that when cops came to his striptease club, they were shown a good time.
What kind of a guy was Jack Ruby? Impulsive. He had a quick temper. That's why they called him Sparky. Loved to fight. And if anybody was really out of line, he'd throw him out.
If Jack Ruby knew that you were a law enforcement officer, they always had plenty of liquor, dancing girls, food, or anything else, because he always thought that we may be able to help him.
Yeah, he did give some free drinks around, and of course when the police went down there, you know, he discounted the drinks to them, and he was a fighter. There's no question about that. When we'd get a disturbance call down there, we'd just wait at the bottom of the stairs, because just a few minutes, that guy or whoever was creating the disturbance was going to come falling down the stairs.
Jack Ruby knew people who were members of the mafia. He had acquaintances from his Chicago days of people that had long prison records, and there's no question that he knew as many people in organized crime or who had criminal records as he knew police on the other side.
The underworld figures Joe and Sam Campisi were part of Ruby's milieu.
Yes, Jack knew the Campises, and I've seen them together on numerous occasions. Jack ate out there at the Egyptian Lounge, and he'd come in, they'd shake his hand, sit down, and sometimes Joe Campisi would sit with him, and if I came in, well, you know, I'd sit with Jack Ruby and Joe Campisi. I knew, we all knew each other well.
The Campisis were lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the mafia godfather who had talked of killing the president.
There's the odor of a mafia hit all around Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald until you examine both Ruby and his actions over that weekend. There is no credible evidence to show that Jack Ruby acted at the behest of anyone in organized crime. It was personally motivated from day one.
If Ruby was a hitman acting for the mafia, he had already missed a perfect opportunity to silence Oswald.
And I asked him if he was packing a pistol at that midnight press conference, and he said yes. And I said, then why didn't you plug him then? And he says, I was afraid of hitting one of you guys.
Ruby spent much of Saturday at Dallas Police Headquarters. That day, Oswald was taken from his cell to be interrogated and made to stand in lineups. As he hung around the police corridors, Ruby had no opportunity to shoot Oswald, but he did keep asking when Oswald was going to be transferred to the county jail.
I've been photographing a T-shirt. Now they're taking me to the lineup. Among these men, that will be kicked out. Right?
Oswald spent his last night in a police cell. The police announced that they would transfer him to the county jail at about 10 o'clock the next morning. If Ruby was stalking Oswald, Sunday morning was his last chance. But there was no sign of him at police headquarters at 10 o'clock as an armored car arrived for Oswald.
Jack Ruby takes over an hour and a half to leave his apartment. He very leisurely goes to the Western Union office. He doesn't appear to be rushed, says the clerk behind the counter, and he sends his $25 MoneyGram. He takes his change, and it's time-stamped at 11:17. Oswald is shot by Ruby 4 minutes later at 11:21.
I did a recheck on that myself from the date stamp time of 11:17 on that telegram, and then it took roughly 83 seconds because I walked at 3 different speeds, slow, fast, and medium, and the average was 83 seconds from the front door of the Western Union to the basement.
It is still unclear how Ruby slipped into the heavily guarded basement. Now, more than an hour late, Jim Lavelle was about to bring Oswald down in the elevator.
Well, I had no idea when I was coming down the elevator, and he certainly could not have. And there was no way you could time that to where he would be in the basement right at the exact moment that I came out of there. And he couldn't have been there more than a minute to 45 seconds to a minute before I arrived with Oswald.
Wearing a light-colored suit and a Stetson, Lavelle was Oswald's escort.
I put the handcuffs on him, And in the process of doing that, I, more in jest, kind of said, Lee, if anybody shoots at you, I hope they're as good a shot as you are, meaning, of course, that they'd hit him and not me. And he kind of laughed, and he said, oh, you're being melodramatic or something to that effect. Nobody's going to shoot at me. And so we walked out, and I was momentarily blinded by those lights. I couldn't see anything. Oswald just groaned when he was shot, just and went down, and that's the only sound he made.
Was the shooting a premeditated mafia hit, or did Sparky Ruby shoot Oswald in a flash of violent rage?
I transferred Jack Ruby to the county jail, and when I asked him why he'd done the shooting, he said he'd thought about it from the Friday night on, but a lot of people thought about it. I've had people tell me, oh, if I could have got to him on Friday afternoon, my anger was such that I would have killed him without looking back.
Oswald never regained consciousness after Jack Ruby shot him.
Captain, where will he be taken?
I'm assuming Parkland Hospital.
Parkland Hospital, the irony of ironies, the place where President John F. Kennedy died. The armored car now has been cleared out of the entranceway. The ambulance is leaving Dallas Police Headquarters.
I was riding in the back with him, holding his arm, trying to reach a pulse. The doctor was massaging his chest, trying to get him to breathe. And he groaned and stretched a little bit, and then just went completely limp. And actually, that's when I think he expired, or then, because I never saw him make another move at all.
At Parkland Hospital, Oswald was pronounced dead. His death meant that the case against him was never tested in court, and many still doubt that it was Oswald who fired the gun found in the Texas School Book Depository. Soon after the shots were fired, police dusted the murder weapon and found partial fingerprints near the trigger guard and a clear palm print under the barrel. At Police HQ, Oswald's palm print was lifted from the rifle. When the FBI rushed the rifle to Washington, the palm print stayed in Dallas, and the chain of evidence was broken. The latent fingerprints on the trigger guard were less well defined and have been largely ignored. Vincent Scalise is one of America's leading fingerprint experts.
The FBI examined these latent prints and they determined that they were worthless for identification purposes. I re-examined the photograph of these latent prints again in 1978 for the Select Committee on Assassinations and came to the same conclusion. Due to the faintness of the prints, I determined that they were of no value for identification purposes.
30 years ago, Rusty Livingston was working in the Dallas Police Crime Lab. He developed pictures taken at the scene of the crime, including the rifle and the latent fingerprints on its trigger guard. Livingston made several sets of prints, including one set for himself, which he has kept until now. It now emerges that the full set of fingerprints from the rifle did not go to the FBI in 1963. This long-neglected evidence was recently examined for the first time. When it was, the prints on the trigger guard were found to have 3 positive and 3 possible points of identity. Though not enough for a positive identification, nothing was inconsistent with Oswald's own prints. In an opinion certain to be controversial, Vincent Scalise is now prepared to go much further.
I took the photographs. There were a total of 4 photographs in all. That I began to examine them, and I saw 2 faint prints. And as I examined them, I realized that these prints had been taken at different exposures. And it was necessary for me to utilize all of the photographs to compare against the ink prints. As I examined them, I found that by maneuvering the photographs in different positions, I was able to pick up some details on one photograph and some details on another photograph. Using all of the photographs at different contrasts, I was able to find in the neighborhood of about 18 points of identity between the two prints. Well, I feel that this is a major breakthrough in this investigation because we're able for the first time to actually say that these are definitely the fingerprints of Lee Harvey Oswald and that they are on the rifle. There is no doubt about it.
The prosecution case against Oswald is open and shut. If he'd shot his brother-in-law in the back seat of a convertible and not the President of the United States, he would have been tried, convicted, and forgotten in 3 days. But for the fact that it's the President, this is an easy case.
Three days after the assassination, Washington and the world mourned President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In Dallas, police honored Officer Tippit. And on that same day, the mortal remains of Lee Harvey Oswald were finally laid to rest.
The question is not, did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot the President? The question is, did he have help? Within 30 hours of the assassination, that was the question. 30 years later, that remains to be the question.
John Kennedy had many enemies. The Mafia had called for his death. Many Cuban exiles celebrated it. There is evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald's life may have intersected with those forces. But they cannot be found in the last days in Dallas influencing Oswald to act. In the end, one does not need a conspiracy to explain Lee Harvey Oswald.
This is a struggle that has gone on with me for almost 30 years now. This is mind over heart. The mind tells me one thing, the heart tells me something else. True, no one saw him actually pull the trigger on the president. But his rifle's there. His presence in the buildings was there. What he did after he left the building is known. Bus ride, taxi ride, boarding house, pick up the pistol, shoot the police officer, eyewitnesses there, 5 or 6. You can't set that aside just because he is saying, I'm a patsy. I'd love to do that, but you cannot, in my mind, set that aside. It's good that people raise questions and say, wait a minute, let's take a second look at this. I think that's great, you know. But when you take the second look and the third and the 40th and the 50th, hey, enough's enough. It's there. Put it to rest.